So today we're going to start with spread 8B, and spread 8B looks at another type of experiment on one of our social influences on behavior, which is obedience. Okay, so today we're going to be learning about what obedience is, what are the factors that can influence how obedient we are, or in other words, how not obedient we are, and also a key experiment that was conducted that showed us the nature of obedience and how humans obey commands from authority. Okay, so before we look at that experiment and we watch that video, we need to understand what obedience is. Now, obedience is a really important part of society. Obviously, if the police are, telling you to pull over on the road, you're going to do it. You're going to obey. So from a young age, we are taught to obey authority. Okay, what does obey mean? What does it mean to be obedient? Obedience means when we follow. Okay, it means you follow the instructions, you follow the commands, you follow the orders of someone who's got authority. Okay, or it doesn't necessarily have to be following someone like an actual person, could even just be following the certain rules or laws or policies that kind of dictate how we should behave in society, okay? How we should behave in a school, how we should behave in a classroom, how we should behave in a workplace, okay? All of these things are also under the heading of obedience there. So one of the best known studies that we look at in the area of obedience is called Milgram's, Stanley Milgram's experiments on obedience. So in psychology, we usually just forget about the first name. That's why we just call him Milgram by his last name. And he was the experimenter or the psychologist who planned and conducted this experiment. Again, similar to the experiment we did in A to A, which was the Stanford prison experiment, Milgram's experiment is quite old. And also similar to that experiment, Milgram's experiment does breach or does violate some of our ethical principles there, which we'll look at a little bit later on in the PowerPoint. So Milgram's experiments on obedience, basically, before we watch the video, I'll just give you guys a little bit of contextual information there. Milgram's experiments on obedience were basically, in order for him to understand whether people will listen to orders that are given by someone who's got authority or by an authority figure, even if those orders were asking them to harm another person or put another person in danger or risk that other person's safety or even their life, okay? So Stanley Milgram was actually the son of two Jewish parents who were actually survivors of the Holocaust, or their ancestors were kind of like survivors of the Holocaust. And so he was really interested in this idea of how is it that normal everyday people who weren't actually evil at their core could kind of follow the orders of Hitler to, kill, hundreds of thousands of, innocent people, okay, during that time. So he conducted this experiment to kind of investigate that idea of obedience, to investigate whether a normal person who has no psychiatric history, who has no abnormalities in terms of personality or negative traits, how is it that a normal person like that could be made to harm another person or to put another person's life in danger? So his study was all about understanding the nature of obedience, okay? Now, in the study, there are three main characters you need to know. The first one is the teacher, okay? And we say that the teacher is the unknowing participant, okay? You've also got a confederate. The confederate is a learner, and the learner is a fake test subject. Okay, what that means is that they are working with the experimenter behind the scenes in order to run the experiment, but they obviously know everything that the experiment is about, and they are in on the experiment, okay? And another word for the teacher is the subject, because this is the actual real participant in the study, okay? And Milgram, or the experimenter in other hands, is the person who kind of sits there giving out the orders. This is our authority figure, okay? This is our authority figure. This is the person in the other room getting the electric shocks, which we'll talk about. And this is the unknowing participant or subject who's come from outside. He's not in on the experiment. He is delivering the electric shocks every time the learner gets a question wrong, okay? And obviously, Milgram, or the experimenter, and the learner have kind of planned this together, that after a certain point, the learner will get many questions wrong in order for the teacher to feel pressured to give the shocks, okay? That was the basic gist of the experiment there, okay? So we'll watch the video now and get a better idea of the experiment. So just before we watch the video as well, just some pictures here, guys. You'll see this guy's picture in the video, especially in the old one. This is the actual confederate, okay? This is the learner. And this is the experiment. As you can see, he's wearing the white lab coat. And then the teacher's obviously watching the learner being, strapped to the electric shock device. Okay. So the teacher sees the exact pain that he or she is going to put that learner through. Okay. And that makes it all the more real that this is an actual real participant, not just someone fake or not just like a voice recording behind the screen. Okay. This is the apparatus, or the kind of electric shock device, we could say. And you can see that it ranges from light shock to XXX. XXX means, danger, severe shock. Okay, this is the kind of shock that can essentially kill someone. Okay, so these were the labels. So you can see there's many switches here. Every time the learner gets a question wrong, which they will do because they've planned this with Milgram to do this, the learner will get an electric shock, and the teacher will push down those levers, or those levers there. Okay. Okay, so that's basically just a little bit of contextual information there. So let's just pause the recording here, and then I'll play the video. And for those of you who want to rewatch this later on, the video links are literally just in the slide, in this particular slide. So if you open up the PowerPoint, you'll find them there. So I'll pause the recording here. Yep, so after watching that video, we can look at a few results and conclusions that we can, oh, sorry, have I shared the screen? Oh, no, I haven't. Okay, hold on. I realized that. Okay. How do I do that? Pause the recording. Okay, so basically what we're looking at now is the results and conclusions that we can draw from Milgram's obedience to authority experiment. So basically all of Milgram's participants continued the experiment. They continued to administer the maximum shock, okay? 65% of them did. Okay, but all of them, you might think, oh, it's only 65%. The remaining 35% of participants were really good. They didn't give them the shock, but actually all participants went on to administer 300 volts. But that's where some of them stopped. That's where some of them were like, okay, I can't go any further. But 65% of the actual teacher participants did go on to administer the maximum 450 volt shock, okay, to the learner. So that's the basic idea there, okay? The basic idea being that when people are given orders or commands or even instructions by an authority figure, someone in authority, someone who seems legit, someone who's wearing a lab coat, someone who seems like they know what they're doing, people are likely to obey. Even just ordinary people. You don't have to be someone who's got a propensity or a tendency for harming others, okay? You can just be an ordinary person with completely normal personality, completely normal tendencies, but you might actually follow the orders given by that authority figure, even if it means that you're harming someone, okay? Giving someone a 450 volt electric shock is automatic death in real life. If that was a real life situation and the learner wasn't just a voice recording playing back, and that was an actual person sitting in that chair, that person would have been dead by the first voltage, okay, by the first shot of that 450 volt electric shock there. So that's the moral of the study, or the basic conclusion that we can draw from the study there. Okay, and Stanley Milgram kind of explains this a little bit more with his quote that it may be that we are puppets, but at least we are puppets with perception, and we're puppets with awareness, okay? And perhaps that by having that awareness of what we're doing, we can actually free ourselves or liberate ourselves to do what we think is right, rather than just doing something that everyone else is doing, or doing something that might harm someone. Okay, so that's the basic results and conclusions that we can draw from Milgram's study there. So there's a question. So what questions would they ask them? Was just, okay, so yeah, so in the Milgram experiment, the questions that the teacher was asking the learner weren't really questions, but they were like word pairs. So for example, you say one word and then they have to choose a word from the pair that matches that word. So if I say, for example, cat, there might be a few options, like the learner might see 4 options, like a multiple choice there. And the other words might be bone, whiskers, tall, and maybe, I don't know, garden. Okay, so the word pair that relates most closely to the word cat would be whiskers. So whiskers would be the correct answer. Obviously, the learner had pre-planned to answer some questions wrong. So everything was already pre-planned. It was just a recording that was playing back. And every time the person got wrong, there'd be like a matching kind of, ow, well, let me out of here. That recording would play back there. Yeah, so that was the results and the conclusions from the study. So just before we finish off for today, we're just going to look at the factors that affect obedience, okay? And we can apply this both to Milgram's study as well as our everyday life, okay, in terms of how we are obedient in our everyday lives. Now, the three factors are group pressure, proximity, and status of the authority figure. And we can use the memory tip GPS to remember that, okay? So G for group pressure, P for proximity, and S for status of authority figure there. So those are the three factors that can affect your obedience. So we'll just have a look at them now. So the first one is group pressure. Group pressure means that the people that are around us, and if we've got more people who can stand with us to be disobedient, we are more likely to be disobedient. Okay, in other words, obedience is less likely to happen if you've got group support for resisting. Okay, what does resisting mean? It means going against. Okay, if, for example, you were a teacher in Milgram's experiment, but you were not just a teacher by yourself, you were like paired with someone else, or you were paired with two other people, and you were all in the same room. If you said, I don't want to go on anymore, and the other two were like, yeah, same with us here, we don't want to go on anymore, that power of the group will actually mean that obedience is less likely to happen, because when one person says, I don't want to do this, the others kind of chime in and say, yeah, we don't want to do this too. Okay, so that is when obedience is less likely to happen, when there's more group pressure against the authority figure. Okay, obedience, on the other hand, is more likely to happen when there is group support for or towards the authority figure. So if no one is going against the authority figure, it's kind of like obedience is more likely to happen. So just looking at the previous example, if you were in a room with two other people and you were protesting to the experimenter and saying, I don't want to go on, this is wrong, but the other two people or the other two teachers in the room with you were saying, what are you talking about? Why are you being so dramatic? Just continue. It's just an experiment. What's the big deal? And they are not actually going against the authority figure, but rather supporting the authority figure. That means that obedience is more likely to happen. So even though you know what you're doing is wrong, you're more likely to still follow the commands of the authority figure there, because you're the only one that's being kind of shot down there. Okay, so that's basically the effect of group pressure on obedience there. Okay. Now there's this incident called the Jonestown Massacre. We used to study it in quite some depth in a previous study design. The Jonestown Massacre is actually one of the most disturbing kind of cult. Most of us would know what a cult is. A cult is just like a huge mass following of a specific person or a specific ideology there. So Jonestown Massacre was basically done by this guy. This guy's name is Jim Jones. Okay, and Jim Jones was this guy who basically created his own kind of religion or his own kind of ideology called the People's Temple. Okay, and the People's Temple was a cult. Okay, he basically gathered many people to kind of follow his religion. He saw himself as basically being like a god or a godlike figure there. And so the people who were in his People's Temple were his followers or his kind of disciples there. Okay, he promised them freedom and unity, and he said he kind of brainwashed them into thinking that I am the key to paradise, or I'm the key for you getting into paradise. Okay, and he called the paradise Jonestown. So the basic idea was, or the basic massacre was, that he, through his brainwashing, through the fact that his followers were so obedient to the extent that they were ready to give up their lives for him, he actually convinced everyone to drink Kool-Aid. Kool-Aid is actually cordial in America. It's what they call cordial. Okay, he convinced everyone to drink Kool-Aid or cordial that had cyanide in it. Cyanide, we know, is poisonous. And he said that, guys, this is our sacrifice, that this, by all of us killing ourselves, or not really killing ourselves, he said it in a more nicer way. He said, by all of us sacrificing ourselves today, we're all going straight up to heaven. And so mothers who were followers in this group who had their children there were giving their children cordial that was poisonous to them. And literally, you can see here, it's not a clear photo, but probably better that it's not quite clear. These are bodies. These are actually dead bodies, taken from a kind of bird's eye view there, that showed us the Jonestown Massacre. Okay, we can link the Jonestown Massacre to group pressure, because in this particular People's Temple cult, people were scared to go against Jim Jones. They were scared to show their lack of obedience towards him, okay? And even when they tried to show their disobedience towards him, even when one or two people tried to pipe up and say, this is wrong, we shouldn't have to kill ourselves, I think it's going too far, others would say, you know what, just shut up, just sit down. Like, you don't want us to get into paradise. If you want to go your own way, you do that, but we want to follow Jim Jones, okay? So that kind of shows you, again, another example of a real life incident that actually led to so many people dying because of the effect of group pressure on disobedience. There's so much about the Jonestown Massacre online and on YouTube, and it's actually a popular cultural reference now as well, okay? Drinking the Kool-Aid. Drinking the Kool-Aid means you fall for something like, you basically kill yourself as a result of just following orders of someone else, okay? It's like a popular saying, okay? So that's basically what group pressure is. Okay. The next thing is proximity. So proximity is about how close or how far away you are from someone. The fact that you're more likely to harm someone if you're distanced further away from them compared to being distanced very close to them. And on the opposite hand, you're more likely to show disobedience if your authority figure is located far away from you. Okay. When the distance is greater, obedience decreases. When the distance is closer to the learner, for example, and you're actually sitting right next to the learner getting electrocuted, you're likely to decrease your obedience to actually harm that person, okay? You're likely to not follow the orders to continue the experiment. So there are two types of proximity. You've got physical proximity, which is basically the actual physical distance between two individuals, like the actual physical distance between the learner and the teacher in this example. And you've got relationship proximity. And this is the closeness or the bond that's shared between individuals, like how close you are to a person socially and emotionally. So for example, if you knew the experimenter, if you were in this study, and let's say the experimenter was someone like, not a stranger to you, but someone like your uncle or someone like your cousin, okay? And maybe this experiment is important for them to complete their PhD or something like that. You are less likely to disobey them because, first of all, you know how important this is to them for this experiment to go well. And number two, they are someone you know out of the experimental setting. Okay, they're someone that you have a relationship with. And so you're more likely to listen to their orders because you don't want to ruin the relationship you have with them outside of that lab setting or outside of the experimental room. Okay, so that's basically the relationship proximity. Similarly, if you knew this person, let's say that as the teacher, you know that this learner is your sister's friend or is your brother's friend or it's your second cousin, you are less likely to harm them. And so obedience will decrease because of that relationship proximity as well. Okay, so that's basically relationship proximity and physical proximity there. Now, Milgram found that the closer the learner or the victim was to the teacher, the more likely the teacher was to refuse to administer the shock. So when you're refusing to administer the shock, you are showing decreased obedience there. Okay, so that's the basic idea, okay, between proximity. If you look at this graph here, you can see that the higher the proximity, proximity to the authority figure, okay, when the proximity is low, you've got the likelihood to obey also being quite low, okay? Whereas when it's high, the likelihood to obey is also quite high there. Okay, that's just the graph taken from your book. So proximity is all about physical distance, okay? So remember P for proximity, P for physical distance. And the last thing is the status of the authority figure. So status of authority figure means that we're more likely to show obedience and we're more likely to follow someone if they actually look like an authority figure or they actually act like an authority figure. What this means, or how we can link this to Milgram's study, is that if the person that was saying, oh, the experiment requires that you continue, or you must continue with the experiment, or please go on, if that experimenter in that study was not wearing a white lab coat or was not having a clipboard, or he just came to the study and he was wearing trackies and like a tank top or something like that, that would make you have kind of less, that would make you less convinced that this guy actually is an authority figure and that I should be listening to him. So you're less likely to listen to him if he doesn't look like or act like the researcher or the experimenter or the scientific authority figure that he is. Okay, so the basic idea being, guys, that an individual is more likely to be obedient when the authority figure is perceived as having legitimate status and legitimate power. And remember, when we learned about types of power in the last spread, we talked about the fact that a lot of the time, different occupations in society and different people who have power in society, they have that power because of their uniform. Okay, so if you're a police officer, it's easier for you to pull someone over on the road and question them if you're wearing a police uniform. Okay. Similarly, if you're, if you're a paramedic and you're kind of like running through the crowd to get to someone who's just fainted, people are more likely to give you way if you're wearing that paramedic, that dark blue uniform there. Okay. Or if they see other people around you wearing that uniform. Okay, so that's basically the relationship between the status of the authority figure and the power that that authority figure is able to exercise. You've got to look genuine. Okay, if you don't look like a genuine authority figure, people are not going to give you that power. People are not going to feel like you're all that. They're not going to actually give you that status there. And as a result of that, they're not likely to follow you or listen to you, okay, in terms of your instructions. So in Milgram's study, the status of the authority figure was shown by the white lab coat that he wore. We all know that everyone looks a bit smarter when they wear a white lab coat. He was also very serious. The experimenter never smiled at the teacher, okay? He made no unnecessary interactions with the teacher, no small talk, no, oh, the weather's been good lately, none of that, okay? So it was only a very serious formal manner. And again, this was to increase the kind of distance between the experimenter and the thing, saying that I'm the experimenter, I'm powerful, I'm all that. You're just a participant in my study, so just go ahead with the experiment. Okay, and he was very focused on his academic work. So he had a clipboard in front of him and a pen, okay, and he was kind of writing the whole time. So that was the authority figure, okay? So yeah, similar to Hitler. Yeah, he symbolized, yeah. So basically, yeah, keeping a very kind of serious tone and not getting on the same level as the teacher there, okay? As the teacher participant. Okay, in everyday life, individuals in authority tend to have visible signs of their authority. So we talked about police officers, paramedics, firefighters is another good example. Okay, when you see a firefighter in uniform, a lot of people tend to give them respect. Okay, I remember the other day I haven't been out of the house for how long, I think it was like probably a few weeks back before we went into ISO. I remember when I was like somewhere, like I think in Coles or something, and then there were a few people in the line, and then there was like, I think someone had come in with like, they were one of those like frontline worker kind of people, like I think it was a paramedic or something, and like the lady in line, like before she was about to put her groceries on the, what do they call them, the conveyor belt or whatever it is, she saw the guy, and then she was like, you can go first. So people actually give these people a lot of status and a lot of respect, and for that reason they are able to exercise that power as well. A lot of them don't abuse that power, obviously, but they have that power there ready to use if they need it. Parking officers as well. If you've parked your car at the station and you see a parking officer loitering about, you might like dash to your car in order to avoid getting a parking ticket. Security guards as well, that stand in front of shops, that stand in front of buildings. Okay, we know that they're security guards because of their uniform. Okay, and if they weren't wearing a uniform, then we probably wouldn't really have that status. They wouldn't have that status or power there. Okay, so that's the status of the authority figure. Really, really important to understand that idea. Okay, so that's the status. The last thing we're looking at now is the ethical issues that arise from Milgram's obedience to authority. So you remember this guy from the video? He was the guy that kept saying, I don't want to go on with this study. The man in there could be dead, blah, blah, blah. Like, and he was really stressed. So even though he was verbally protesting that he didn't want to go on, he still continued to go on. And this is the quote from Stanley Milgram, that I observed a mature and initially poised businessman enter the lab smiling and confident, but within 20 minutes, he was reduced to a nervous wreck. He was about to collapse. He constantly pulled on his ears. He twisted his hands. At one point, he pushed his fists into his forehead and said, please, let's stop it. So you can see that there's clear distress here, and there's a clear breach of that no harm principle, okay? The participant's security, the participant's safety, the participant's rights have all been kind of compromised in this study there. Okay, so that's the basic ethical issue. Now, if we look at our little seesaw, like we did in the previous slide, you can see again that there aren't as many ethical breaches or violation in Milgram's experiment compared to Zimbardo's, but we still do have some. For example, deception and debriefing. We know that Milgram didn't tell participants the true nature of the study. He told them that it's a study about learning and memory rather than obedience. But the problem is that even though the participants went through some mental health issues and some of them were distressed, Milgram didn't actually properly carry out debriefing, or so that's what people say, okay, that's what your book indicates as well. He did check in on the participants, tell them that this is the deal, we told you it was about memory and learning, but it was actually about obedience. But he didn't really, similar to Zimbardo, he didn't really check in on them after that. Okay, he didn't check in them after a week's time and say, how are you going? You feeling okay, blah, blah, blah. So it's unclear as to how rigorously or how properly the debriefing procedures were conducted. Withdrawal rights, the nature of the study is one of obedience. So basically, many of those teacher participants who wanted to leave felt pressure to obey and stay on to the experiment. So basically, the experimenter kept saying, the experiment requires that you continue. So that itself, that line or that quote itself is a clear breach of withdrawal rights. Also, probably because, again, because this study was about obedience, participants were not told explicitly before the study began that you have the right to leave at any time. They weren't told that one line there, okay? So that is also a breach of withdrawal rights. The no harm principle, clearly some participants were very disturbed by the study. Some of them experienced high levels of stress and anxiety, guilt, concern, worry, okay, at the thought that they were actually delivering electric shocks to another person. Remember, the teacher doesn't know that it's a voice recording playing. They think that it's an actual person that's actually hooked up to the electric shock generator there. So they were obviously worried, okay, because they thought they were harming an actual person there. So obviously, because the well-being was compromised for the teacher participants, we see a clear breach of the no harm principle there because harm did occur. The two things that were met are similar to Zimbardo's experiment. Informed consent was met. He did give them, informed consent procedures. He did ask them to sign the form. Okay, so the informed consent was met, and voluntary participation was also met because Milgram basically recruited his teacher participants through, again, newspaper ads, and he also sent letters out to put in people's mailboxes as well. So that's all convenient sampling because the teacher participants who eventually came forward to be in the study were participating through their own free choice and their own free will then, okay? So just know any two breaches, you've got three, so learn any two, and you've only got two ethical principles that were met, so you've got to learn those two. Okay, so that's the basic idea there. Okay, guys, that basically covers spread 8B for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording here.